children of Africa are still fast asleep and too busy running away from Africa.
Every time an African voice gets too loud, too clear, and too real, it gets silenced. That's not paranoia, that's history. They assassinated Thomas Sankara. They toppled Patrice Lumumba. And when Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao, the African Union ambassador to the US, started exposing the ugly truth about how Africa is still controlled by colonial powers, what happened? She didn't get applause. She didn't get protection. She got fired. Now ask yourself why. In today's video, we will tell you and show you exactly why. Let's get started. Here's the thing about power. It doesn't waste time debating with the wrong people. It ignores them. But when somebody starts landing too close to the truth, the gloves come off. And that's exactly what happened with Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao. This woman wasn't standing on the street with a protest sign. She was the African Union's ambassador to the United States, the official representative of Africa to Washington, a position where you're expected to smile, cut ribbons, shake hands, and never ruffle feathers. Instead, she picked up the microphone and detonated the entire script. She said the unsayable. Africa is still colonized, just in new packaging. Now think about that for a second. Every year, you hear speeches from world leaders about Africa's bright future, about partnerships and progress. But behind the polite handshakes, the deals are rotten. The contracts are written to bleed African nations dry. The currencies are manipulated. The resources are carted off by foreign corporations. Everybody in power knows this, but they depend on silence. And Dr. Arikana refused to stay silent. She laid it out bluntly. France still controls the money of 14 African nations. Western aid isn't charity, it's a leash. Foreign embassies across Africa aren't just diplomatic buildings. They're power centers pulling strings behind the scenes. And instead of getting applause for speaking the truth, she got the boot. Fired. Out. Gone.
Their sole purpose was to act as if they're coming to rescue Africa. Africa has been the provider. If you look at Europe, Europe cannot survive without Africa. But what they don't tell you is that Africa, through exploitation of its resources by the Europeans, was actually a much, much bigger contribution to the European recovery post-World War II. Nobody talks about that. Let me tell you, we need to look at what's happening in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. President Traore is standing up. He is saying the natural resources in Burkina Faso, they belong to the people of Burkina Faso. African leaders must also say Africa.
Ask yourself, if she was spouting nonsense, why fire her? You don't silence clowns, you laugh at them. But they didn't laugh, they panicked. Because once she started saying these things on American soil in front of American audiences, the mask was slipping. She wasn't telling Africa something Africans didn't know. She was telling the West something the West didn't want its own citizens to hear. And that's a whole different threat. History is full of this same story. Leaders who expose exploitation don't get invited to dinners. They get assassinated, overthrown, or in her case, quietly pushed out. The pattern is too obvious to ignore. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, even Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. All of them spoke a language that terrified colonial powers. Independence. And independence, real independence, doesn't mean singing the national anthem. It means breaking the pipelines of wealth extraction. Dr. Arikana had the guts to remind the world that Africa is still being looted under the banner of freedom, and that's why she became radioactive. The AU didn't just fire her because she was controversial. They fired her because she was dangerous, not to Africa, but to the people who still profit from Africa's.
The majority of African leaders, and not just African leaders, but leaders in the developing world, are celebrating the exit of USAID. I was listening to a program, I believe it was CNN, and I was jumping up and down. It was a government official from Hungary. He was echoing the same sentiments. He said they are happy USAID is leaving Hungary because they are always supporting opposition. They're
suffering. Now, let us tell you the biggest scam of the last century. They convinced the world that colonialism ended. Parades, flags, Independence Days, national anthems, and everybody cheered. The Europeans went home, the soldiers lowered their flags, and the textbooks declared Africa free. But Dr. Arikana has one question that slices through the celebration. If colonialism ended, then why is Africa still chained to its former masters? Look at the numbers. 14 African countries still use a currency called the CFA franc. Sounds harmless, right? Just another piece of money. Except it's not theirs. It's printed in France. It's guaranteed by the French treasury. And here's the kicker. Those African nations are required to keep 50% of their foreign reserves in Paris. Imagine your paycheck being deposited directly into someone else's bank, and you only get to use it if they say yes. That's not freedom. That's financial slavery in design.
They said you will only use the currency that we created for you because you're special Africans. We call it the CFA. There was the Central African CFA and the Western African CFA, same animal. And that France is the only one that can print it for you. 1958. Fast forward. They're still printing it for us. And if you start misbehaving, they just stop printing your money. And your country's in trouble. They also said your language of instruction shall be French, whether you like it or not. That France will have military presence in your country, that your military can only be trained by France, that you can only buy military equipment from France, that you cannot have any military alliance with your neighbor, and that in the event of war, your allegiance is only to France. And furthermore,
Designer packaging. And it doesn't stop there. Contracts signed decades ago still give Western companies the first bite of Africa's resources. Uranium mined in Niger keeps French lights on in Paris, while Niger's own people live in darkness. Oil from Nigeria powers cars in Europe while Nigerian citizens endure fuel shortages. These are not accidents. They're the deliberate leftovers of a system that never really went away. But here's the genius of neocolonialism. It hides behind paperwork instead of bayonets. Back in the day, colonizers showed up with guns, forced people into mines and plantations, and called it an empire. Today, they show up with contracts, currency agreements, and aid packages, and they call it partnership. Same result, different costumes. Colonialism didn't die. It put on a suit and started speaking the language of economics. Dr. Arikana doesn't sugarcoat it. She calls it out for what it is, theft with a smile. And that's what makes her message so dangerous. Because once you strip away the illusions, once you see that independence is mostly symbolic, you start asking real questions. If these nations are still bound financially to France, then who's really in charge? If the resources still leave the continent to feed foreign economies, then who's actually independent? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're political dynamite. Because if enough people start connecting the dots, the entire illusion of post-colonial Africa crumbles. And you better believe Paris, London, and Washington know it. That's why they'd rather brand her as radical than admit she's right. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. We know everyone loves the United Nations. Blue helmets, peacekeeping, those giant speeches in New York, where leaders pretend the world is one big happy family. The UN markets itself as the conscience of humanity. But if you listen to Dr. Arikana, that image cracks wide open. Because behind the flags, behind the speeches, the UN is less a guardian of peace and more a bouncer at the club, making sure only the powerful get in and Africa stays at the back of the line. Here's the uncomfortable math. Africa makes up more than a quarter of the UN's membership, 54 countries. Yet how much real power does the continent have? Zero. The Security Council, the body that actually makes binding decisions on war, peace, sanctions, and intervention, has 5 permanent members: the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. No Africa. Not a single African seat. And those 5 countries each have veto power. Translation: if all 54 African nations scream no, but one of those 5 says yes, guess who wins? Not Africa. Dr. Arikana calls it out for what it is, a rigged game. Africa provides the battlegrounds, the resources, the soldiers, and often the victims, but not the voice. When wars erupt in Africa, when leaders are toppled, when resources are pillaged, The UN steps in with statements, resolutions, and peacekeepers. But when it comes to decisions that actually shift power, Africa's locked out of the room. And let's not pretend this is some oversight. It's by design. The UN was built in 1945, when colonial empires still ran half the world. Britain and France sat at the top table while their colonies were voiceless. Fast forward to today, and the colonies might have gained flags, but the power structure is frozen in time. France and Britain still hold permanent seats, two European countries with declining populations and fading economies, while 1.4 billion Africans get nothing. How is that justice? Dr. Arikana's fury comes from seeing this hypocrisy up close. She's not theorizing from a classroom. She was inside the system. And she makes the obvious point no one else dares say. The UN isn't about equality. It's about control. It allows the powerful to present themselves as peacekeepers while pulling strings to protect their interests. And Africa, despite being the most resource-rich continent on Earth, is kept voiceless, so those interests can keep flowing. Think about the irony. The UN deploys peacekeepers in Africa more than anywhere else. Billions spent on operations. Yet those same African countries have no permanent say in how peacekeeping is run. No veto power, no seat at the decision-making table. It's like being trapped in a courtroom where you're always the defendant, but never the judge. And that's why Dr. Arikana's words sting. Because once you strip away the blue flags and the diplomatic language, the UN looks less like a beacon of hope and more like a colonial relic wearing a new uniform. And the silence around this truth? That's not ignorance. That's strategy. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
And the second one is to galvanize the African diaspora to participate in the development of Africa. Who are the African diaspora? According to the African Union definition, African diaspora are all people of African descent living outside Africa. The 55 African heads of states understand very clearly that in order for Africa to take its rightful place on the world stage, in order for sustainable development to come to Africa, the African diaspora must be.
Dr. Arikana frames it bluntly. The diaspora is Africa's secret weapon. For too long, Africans abroad have been cut off from the continent by design. Colonial education told them Africa was backward. Western media fed them images of poverty and chaos. Immigration systems made sure brain drain flowed one way, out of Africa. It's the perfect setup. Strip the continent of talent, then convince that talent to assimilate and never look back. But here's the shift. People are starting to look back. Whether it's through remittances, investments, or simply rediscovering their identity, the diaspora is reconnecting. And when Dr. Arikana speaks, she isn't whispering. She's practically shaking them awake. Africa needs you. Your skills, your money, your voice. And the minute you reconnect, the chains break. And let's be clear, that's why her message is dangerous. Because if the diaspora mobilizes, they bring something Africa's enemies fear most: independence from Western gatekeepers. A doctor trained in the US setting up a hospital in Ghana means fewer aid contracts for foreign NGOs. An engineer in Canada starting a manufacturing plant in Nigeria means fewer imports from Europe. A Silicon Valley coder building African apps means Silicon Valley loses its monopoly. Every diaspora connection weakens the grip of exploitation. Think about the history. Whenever Black communities across the world have united, it has terrified the establishment. From Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement to the civil rights alliances with African liberation struggles, unity has always been painted as dangerous. Why? Because it exposes the truth. African people at home and abroad are not powerless victims. They are a force capable of reshaping global power. Dr. Arikana knows this, and that's why she keeps hammering the diaspora. She tells them, stop waiting for permission, stop begging for inclusion. The continent doesn't need saviors, it needs its own children to come home. And once that happens, the whole idea of Africa as a charity case evaporates. Instead, Africa becomes what it always was, the foundation of global wealth. Now let us hit you with the biggest lie ever sold, that Africa is poor. Poor? Africa is the richest continent on this planet, not by opinion, but by fact. Gold, diamonds, cobalt, lithium, oil, uranium, fertile land, and sunlight that could power solar grids for centuries. You name it, Africa's got it. And not in scraps, in abundance. Yet somehow, the continent that fuels the entire modern world gets painted as helpless and broken. That's not just an oversight, that's propaganda. Dr. Arikana puts it in the simplest terms. Africa is not poor, it's being robbed. And she's right. Let's take cobalt. 70% of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Without cobalt, you don't have iPhones, you don't have Teslas, you don't have the entire green tech revolution. That means your electric car, your smartphone, your laptop, all powered by Africa's dirt. Yet Congo is still labeled as one of the poorest countries on earth. How? Because the profits don't stay there. They flow out to corporations in Europe, America, and now even Asia. Same story with oil. Nigeria exports millions of barrels every single day. But ordinary Nigerians stand in gas lines. Same with gold. Ghana is one of the world's top producers. Yet the wealth never trickles down. The system is rigged so the wealth leaves the continent before Africans ever see it. And when the media shows Africa, it doesn't show the trillions being extracted. It shows starving children, dusty villages, and civil wars. Why? Because poverty images keep the scam running. They justify aid programs, they mask resource theft, and they tell Africans, you can't do it without us. But here's the kicker. Africa doesn't need saving. It needs sovereignty. Dr. Arikana insists that if Africa starts processing its own resources, building its own industries, and keeping profits on the continent, the so-called developed world would be on its knees. Think about it. If African nations decided tomorrow, no more exporting raw cobalt, only finished batteries, the global tech market would grind to a halt. If Africa said, no more uranium exports unless we build our own nuclear plants, half of Europe would panic. And that's why the narrative of poverty is so important to maintain. Because if people saw Africa as it truly is, the engine of the global economy, they'd start asking why Africans aren't the ones benefiting. And the answer would expose centuries of theft disguised as trade.
So in actuality, France is taking out of Africa trillions of dollars year in and year out. From us poor people, Africans.
So let's be clear. Africa's so-called poverty isn't natural. It's manufactured. It's enforced through unfair contracts, debt traps, currency manipulation, and propaganda. And Dr. Arikana's message slices through it all. The world runs on Africa, but Africans are told they can't run themselves. That's the biggest lie of all. These are the reasons why Dr. Arikana is too dangerous for the West. Do you think she says anything wrong? Is telling the truth the very reason she is hated by the West? Let us know in the comment section. What do you think about her? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.